very warm welcome to all of you from different countries. I'm very glad to see you and to see you again. And we are all very curious to hear this evening a lot about fake news in the political discourse. And my special welcome is to Professor Martin Risius. He is a professor in Neu-Ulm. You know Ulm, and on the other side of the Danube is Neu-Ulm. It's a Hochschule, and he is in Neu-Ulm not so long time, as in 2 years, Martin?
I'm almost coming up to 1 year.
1 year. And I know that all had been so happy, especially the specialists who know what you had done and what you can do. And so all had been happy to welcome you in Neu-Ulm. But we take profit today. You are professor of digital society and online engagement, and you have an institute for digital innovation, and you are in not only in Bavarian, but in not only in Germany, but in all the world. You are in some committees and so on and so on. We are very grateful that you take time this evening to speak to us about a theme we are in contact every day by television, by journals, by internet, and so on. And we are all a little bit confused, perhaps we are afraid, and so on. And we hope you can explain a little bit the different kinds of fake news and how we can distinguish or what we can do to understand more what is fact, what is fake news. Thank you. As I said before, we are not professionals, so when we don't understand, please give sign and he will explain in in another time or in another language. And also speak slowly if possible, because the translators, as you know, are not professionals, but volunteers, very, very nice volunteers. And so they try to give on. So thank you very much, and up to you, Martin.
Yeah, thank you very much for the warm welcome. It's a great honor to be here and present to this crowd. Yeah, I'll start sharing my slides and then maybe that helps trace what we're talking about. Yeah, so as you mentioned, I'm Martin Risius. I'm a professor at the University of Neu-Ulm, University of Applied Sciences in Neu-Ulm. I joined last year from Brisbane in Australia, through the Bavarian Distinguished Professorship Initiative that is funded through the Bavarian High Tech Agenda. And today I get the opportunity to present a bit of our work, and in particular, our work on disinformation, on fake news. And at the end, I understand there will be room for questions, so I think we'll just walk through and then do questions at the end. Okay. So what's my specialty area of expertise and what do my team and I work on? We're working on what is called trust and safety issues. Trust and safety deals with abuse of digital technologies and how to create safe online environments. So here you can see an overview of all the things that we're working on. In the first row, you would see things where we work towards understanding the threats that we face online. And those aren't all threats that exist, but that is what my team and I work on. If I talk about my team, we're 8 assistants here at Neu-Ulm, and then 4 more assistants around the world, and a few affiliated professors. So we can, I assume we can cover a fair bit of topics, but still not all of the issues. Okay, so the first row of topics that you can see that we're working on, this is a bit of an commercial break is fake news or disinformation, echo chambers, online extremism, doxing, so the weaponization of personal information by sharing it with other people. We deal with implicit hate speech, as well as explicit hate speech. I'll come to that in a moment, and the broader context of information warfare. We're currently adding a few issues that we see arising surrounding digital vigilantism, organized ransomware attacks, and what we call narrative-based attacks. That's still very early stage, but just to give you an idea about the broad range of issues that we're looking at. In our second line of work, we're trying to develop tools to help us deal with these issues, most notably probably deploying AI tools to identify and counter hate speech, or building chatbots to help train people deal with certain issues. And then lastly, we're doing what we're doing right now. We're trying to do outreach, presentations, trainings, and collaborate with industry and government stakeholders to make sure that our work is not just limited to publications in scientific outlets, but can also have societal impacts. And as I mentioned, our work is funded from the Bavarian Ministry of Sciences and Arts, generously supported through the Distinguished Professorship Program. Yeah. Okay, but getting to the topic of what is disinformation and fake news, I kind of built this whole presentation around common questions that I receive quite often, and I thought it would be helpful to just walk through them and because I find it helps us get a broader understanding just of what fake news is. And the first thing that I always try to emphasize, and we'll come back to that as well, but this concept here is a very helpful, it's a helpful conceptualization to help us understand why disinformation is such a difficult issue to deal with. Is the core point I'm trying to emphasize is fake news actually isn't much of the issue. People always invite me to talk about fake news, and fake news is everywhere in the discourse. But what I'm trying to get people to understand, if this is the one thing that you can take away from this talk, it is that the issue needs to be false news and not fake news. Okay, so what I'm trying to highlight on this slide will be, what does the concept of false news entail? And the rest of the talk, I'll still emphasize the issues that arrive from this and fake news in particular, but this is a key concept that we need to understand. The range of false news ranges from misinformation to disinformation. Misinformation is accidentally created and is slightly misleading. So is misleading. And that can happen by accident or on purpose, but it is not as grave as if we're going over to the right-hand side of this fabricated false and fake information that is intentionally created in order to create a certain narrative or express a certain viewpoint against objectively observable facts. So in this broad context, fake news is on the right side of the spectrum, is a disinformation. And what fake news does is it is a kind of disinformation that suggests a news-like character. So in an academic sense, this is what we mean when we talk about fake news, is disinformation that mimics news. So it's a very special issue. Oftentimes in our public discourse, when we talk about fake news, we don't really care. We call all of this fake news. But this whole spectrum from misinformation to disinformation is actually false news and not fake news. Now, another point that's important to consider here, and that makes false news so difficult to deal with, is that it occurs on different levels. Misinformation and disinformation can occur on three different levels. It can address the core of an information, so I can create a fake fact and present that as an information. I can change the surrounding contextual information, so the accompanying information. So I can alter the title or the author information or whatnot, and I can decontextualize an information and present an information, potentially true information, but in a distorted context. I understand this is very conceptual at the moment. I promise you at a later point, I will clarify why this is important. But for now, I'd say we just stick to the idea, to the understanding that fake news is a very special form of disinformation. False news includes misinformation and disinformation, and that this can occur, this fabrication of news can occur on several levels. It can occur on the core, on the meta context, or in the context of an information. Moving on, a question I'm oftentimes asked is, how do I spot fake news? And then one of the common themes that I find people talk about is if it's an information that polarizes. And that is to some extent true, but we have a more comprehensive understanding of common persuasion techniques that malicious actors use in order to influence the audience. And here's a whole bunch of those techniques. Don't worry, I won't go into detail about all of them, but I do want to point out that polarization, being a polarizing content, like an emotionally charged post, is a very good indicator of something being fake, but it's not the only one. If it was, then fake news would be very easy to detect and deal with. But unfortunately, there's a lot more to manipulate, a lot more manipulation techniques that are used to disseminate fake news. And then there's an important aspect that I want to point out is how fake news have evolved over time. The first time that we really started talking about fake news was during the 2016 US presidential election. And in the following, I will try to highlight the changes that we see in 4-year intervals with the different US presidential elections, because they are so present in our understanding that it helps us understand how fake news have transformed over time. So when we talked about 2016 fake news, a lot of the topic was around the Russian Internet Research Agency, the IRA, that we now know was affiliated with the Wagner Group, that spread fake news through troll and bot accounts as part of the to influence discourse on the presidential election. So that was very much driven by trolls and bots. One thing that is oftentimes not considered is we think because Donald Trump won the election, that it was only right-wing or Republican accounts that spread that disinformation or that fake news at the time. But actually what happened was we also see not as many, but still a substantial amount of Democrat accounts or left-leaning accounts. So there were troll and bot accounts fabricated that, for example, supported Black Lives Matters. It was Black Lives Matter Joe posted something. So from there, we knew polarization was the core goal of disinformation of spreading disinformation. It's about societal polarization and just creating discord amongst people. When we move on to 2020, the nature of disinformation had changed substantially. What it changed was it wasn't only driven by bots and trolls anymore. It was spread by authentic, real accounts. So real people started sharing and spreading disinformation or fake news. And that's a substantial shift, a cultural shift that we can observe. And so what we call this transition is a transition from troll and bot-driven disinformation campaigns in 2016 to what we now call participatory disinformation campaigns. That very much is not so, it still includes trolls and bots, but the majority of the impact is created by real accounts, as in this case here, the Trump family spreading fake news. And then coming on to the last election, the change that we were all afraid of would happen was a proliferation of AI-generated fake news and deepfakes. We didn't see it happen that much then. What we saw was malicious actors realizing it's a lot easier to simply buy influencer accounts. So the key change that we saw from 2020 to 2024 was the idea that we could simply pay off influencers to spread our fake news. That means you don't need to go through the hassle of creating botnets, troll accounts, coordinating their activities, and then trying to find a way to spread reach. You don't need to convince advocates or people or opinion leaders anymore to spread your fake news, but you can simply pay people who already have a reach to spread disinformation. So that was a core change that we saw from over the last 4 years. What's the outlook now that we're seeing probably happen in the future? A key part is the emergence of AI-generated fake news. We see campaigns already leaning heavily on that, particularly at the moment here in Europe, targeting France and Germany to change public opinion on certain issues. We see this being publicly released through politically sponsored ads. That is possible now. The checks on that have disappeared. It used to be protected. Political ads used to be protected. It's not anymore, at least not as much. And then a very concerning stage is we see entirely fabricated personas. So you can basically pay marketing agencies to create influencer personalities for you now. So they seem like real people who post stories, post about their private life, go on vacations, post videos with their friends, but they're entirely fake actors. They are entirely AI generated. So you can buy or build them yourself, AI generated influencers. People are already making lots of money of these AI generated accounts. Yeah, I've added here an example if you want to see what that kind of looks like. This is what a troll farm looks like. You see a couple of graphic cards here working to run those different trolls on the screen. You have the overview. Yeah. So moving on to how this is used and how this materializes in reality. There are a couple of influence operations that we can observe or that are publicly being reported on that are in part still ongoing. A prominent one is the Russian doppelganger influence operation. It's called a doppelganger because it starts off with fake social media accounts, but those accounts, yeah. So fake social media accounts posting news like fake news, and here you can or fabricated articles, mostly AI generated at this point. And the doppelganger bit is they are mimicking established news media or new news portals. So instead of here's some example. Instead of Welt.de, which is a major German news outlet, they create Welt PM and post their logo resembles the Welt.de, the original news account, and they just post stuff in that name, suggesting credibility. They mimic Frankfurter Allgemeine, they mimic Bild, all major news outlets here in Germany in order to create reach and suggest credibility. If you talk to, and I'm glad we have some Ukrainians here, we also talk with Ukrainian researchers about this. They oftentimes find this is nothing new, what Russia is doing. This is just a page out of the old Russian propaganda textbook. And it's interesting to see because it's not that well known actually in Germany, these propaganda techniques that are in Russian propaganda textbooks. So the Russian talk about Maskirovka and reflexive control, and I'll come to that in a moment. But when we talk about these disinformation campaigns that target our society, we also need to acknowledge that these are not solely Russian. Yeah, there are heaps of reports, for example, regarding the coronavirus or the corona pandemic, where the US ran massive disinformation campaigns in the Philippines, for example, about the ineffective Chinese vaccine, where they said it works 50-50, and it turns out it actually wasn't that bad, but it persuaded a lot of Philippine people not to get the only vaccine that was available to them, which was the Chinese one. And it's argued that it caused tens of thousands of people to die by not getting vaccinated. So acknowledging that this is not purely a Russian system, but actually happening from all, at least major nations in that space, I want to highlight how this resembles Russian propaganda tactics. And Russian propaganda tactics built on 3 levels of agents. They build on what's called fully employed agents of influence, locally recruited agents, or unwitting agents. And we can match that to what I just described in terms of the evolution of disinformation. Fully employed agents were people that were paid by Russia to spread Russian propaganda. So this is what we saw in 2016 with the trolls and the bots. Those were Russian accounts, Russian people posting disinformation and spreading fake news. In 2020, if you recall, we transitioned to participatory disinformation campaigns. What happened there is we built on locally recruited agents of influence. The idea there is you pick opinion leaders in certain communities and convince them to spread your propaganda news. In the context, in the online environment, those were the politicians and certain influences. And then you have the unwitting agents of influence. So the MAGA movement, for example, people who believe what those opinion leaders say, pick it up and spread it. That's when you have a fully participatory disinformation campaign. So if you're familiar with Russian propaganda textbooks, you see this is nothing for people familiar with those techniques. They say this is nothing new. And what the idea behind it is to control reflexes, because Russia has figured out that it is a lot better if I want someone to do what I want them to do. One way is to force them to do exactly that and to imply force to do it. Another way is to trigger their reflexes so that they then behave in that way that I want them to behave in. So they trigger discourse in order to create social polarization. They pull on the heartstrings of or on the ideologies of certain groups and know they will react to it. So they control the reflexes. Instead of controlling the behavior, they control the triggers that create those behaviors. Okay, applying that again to a specific example. This is another disinformation campaign. It's currently known as information overload, as Operation Information Overload. And we can see those things spread out. Technically, they start off with some seeder accounts that seed disinformation, and then and then they spring to pinger accounts where they go and tag those fake news in comments and help amplify it to create public awareness, get those unwitting agents to come in and like them. That then motivates certain opinion leaders to pick up the news and spread it even further. I'll come to that point later again, but a particular novelty about this information overload operation is that now Russia reaches out directly to fact-checking organizations and asks them to fact-check their own news, because they will know once the fact-checkers flag that fake news story as false, it will create an even broader reach, and it will create even more societal polarization, because certain people will say, it's actually true. Other people will say, it can't be true. See the censorship and all that. Another question that I get asked quite regularly is, how is anything about this new, and what has changed about the online environment? And don't worry, again, I won't go through the details of this model, but I like it to help emphasize what's changed and the implications of the modern information environment. Traditionally, and let's try not to focus too much on that figure because there are a lot of arrows here. Traditionally, if a politician or a person tried to reach an audience, they had to go through a gatekeeper. The gatekeeper was a news organization, was a TV channel. That gatekeeper had the power to filter out messages and information. That role has changed substantially. What we see now happening is some people argue there are no gatekeepers anymore because news organizations don't control their audience anymore. I would say that's a bit of an oversimplification. Instead, what I would say is that the gatekeepers have been replaced. It used to be news organizations who were the gatekeepers, but now the news organizations, just as any other person, has to struggle or struggles to get the attention of the audience that is mediated through platforms. So the new gatekeeper now is not news organizations anymore. It's the platforms. And this has a couple of implications. I won't go into the details of it now, but one key change that I want to highlight here, and I think that's crucial for the proliferation of disinformation or fake news, is that information is now shared in a different way. Traditionally, when news media was the gatekeeper, the criteria by which they spread news was journalistic quality standards. So they shared news after researching other sources, confirming opinions, and then they would give it a little bit of a spin and a framing to address the interests of their audience. But that was the criteria by which information was selected. What we see now is platforms emphasize they don't do that kind of filtering anymore. Filtering for what content passes on to the audience is driven by engagement and attention. There's not a quality control anymore in itself. If the audience was to only be interested in quality news, then there would be a quality filter implied. But the platforms themselves don't have a quality filter. The platforms look at what engages the audience. What do you find interesting? And then I'll recommend you similar content. And this will also help to highlight why dealing with disinformation or fake news is so difficult. What we see here is is taken from a post from Mark Zuckerberg himself. What he describes is the engagement a post gets on the y-axis in relation to the quality or the how toxic basically a content is. And so on the left-hand side of the x-axis, you kind of see your cat videos or whatever you will have, like very positive content, not contested at all. On the very right-hand side, you would have the most disgusting content that you wouldn't want to see. So child sexual abuse material, stuff about like violence and those kinds of things, yeah. And somewhere along the lines, along that dimension, platforms make a cutoff and say this is unacceptable and this is okay. And we can argue about where that line should be drawn, but it happens somewhere. And what we see is the closer you get to that policy violating content, the higher the engagement. Why is that the case? It happens because in that area, in that what we call borderline content or gray area content, both sides clash. On the left-hand side, there's no reason to clash because everyone thinks, oh, cat videos are nice. On the right-hand side, the content doesn't even appear ideally. But in that borderline content area, what happens is one side says, ah, finally someone is telling the truth. And the other side says, ah, this is false, this is fake, you shouldn't believe it. And this is where then engagement goes up and where then algorithms come in and say, oh, we see a lot of engagement in this kind of content, so let's spread it to more people. And if you remember what I said at the early stages when I was talking about that egg and the different levels of how manipulation can be misused, this is where this will come in handy. I'll come to it in a moment. The news that was fact-checked in the election was the claim that Canadians face a major donut shortage after the first day of cannabis legalization. So they thought all Canadians ran to the donut shops because they all had their yummies and were hungry for some crappy food. That was entirely fabricated and fake, and hence it was removed. What didn't get removed was Donald Trump's claim for election fraud. And why was it not removed? because he said there are voting slips from military members found in the trash, and they have Donald Trump's name on it. They voted for Donald Trump. Now, the truth of that post, and coming back to that egg, the core information was true. There were voting slips, they had Donald Trump's name on it, and they were found in the trash. But what wasn't mentioned about it was 8 voting slips. 6 of them were for Donald Trump and 2 were for Joe Biden. And nobody knew why they had been discarded and whether it was just people filled them out wrongly and people actually got to report them and actually got to vote. So, but because the core of the information was true, it was just decontextualized massively. It couldn't be removed because it wasn't fake. It was just entirely distorted to create a certain narrative. And so that shows why it's so difficult to moderate content. And if we just keep hoping that a fact check, be it AI-driven or whatever, will fix it, it won't work because you can decontextualize fake news so much that the core is true, but regulating that kind of free speech would be so distorting that you create massive societal uproar. Another way in which this was misused was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC. She's a US left-wing politician, and people fabricated a claim about her being having millions of dollars from speaking engagement in industry funds. AOC responded by saying, I actually don't even have $500,000 to my name. So she tried to debunk that fake news. The response by the community was, oh, look, or by a certain part of the population, she's in this powerful position and can't even make money. So whichever way you react to these fake news just creates polarization and responses to it and helps confirm your own confirmation bias. So when I talk about the issue, and I'll try not to go on too much more, but what I'll try to emphasize is that fake news itself is not necessarily the problem. The difficult part is the impact of the borderline content. So in that gray area where both sides can argue either point and focus on different sides of the argument. What we see is fake news actually is quite rare, like the very specific kind of fake news that I mentioned in the academic understanding of what constitutes fake news. We see it only makes up about 0.1% of the overall information that you consumed. Oftentimes, we don't even experience fake news ourselves. We just hear it reported to us from the news media, but we don't see it posted to us. But the gray area content, the borderline content, is a lot more frequent. And the problem with that is it's not only more prominent, but it's also way more persuasive. If you weigh the borderline content, the number of posts that you see in borderline content, plus its times its believability, it has a way broader impact than the fake news. We're actually quite good at identifying fake news and discarding it. Stuff that's entirely fabricated, we're quite good at spotting it and not believing it. But the borderline stuff, where people can argue both sides of it, is way more impactful on our opinions. Now we have all sorts of countermeasures and content moderation approaches to the fake news. But the one that is commonly fairly consistently valued as the most effective one is what we call pre-bunking, or sometimes called attitude inoculation. What it builds on is trying to train people to spot these, to understand these manipulative persuasion tactics that I mentioned in the beginning, that I had all in those two rows in the beginning. Educate people on them, expose them to a certain amount of fake news, and then um, and then when you've gone through that training and experience fake news in the real world, you're kind of vaccinated against it. So, for example, it dissuades you from engaging into these toxic conversations. Here's just an example of what the Russian disinformation campaigns have done in order to spread their narrative in terms of reaching out to fact checkers and asking them to fact check the story that they knew was false in order to convince them to then publish it as false and create that societal polarization. If we look at the news stories that have been shared, we can start to abstract certain narratives that are being emphasized and thereby see the focus of the Russian propaganda machine. And the key part is here to understand the problem will not be solved by fact-checking individual pieces of information, because it's not about the individual fake news articles. What's important to understand are the narratives that are fed to society through this disinformation campaigns. Disinformation in terms of you can't trust Ukrainian governments. You can't, German democratic parties are the end of it all. Whatever you can think, like those broad narratives are currently reinforced through those fake news. But we need to start understanding the narratives and move on towards the narratives instead of focusing on the individual fake news articles. So coming to an end, what are some of the things that I hope we can take from this talk about disinformation today? Fake news is not an issue that is easily resolved because it's not the result of, or it's not, the issue are not individual pieces of false news, of fake news. It's the narrative that is being reinforced onto society on those different levels of disinformation, then picked up by algorithms and promoted to have broad societal damage. The second misconception that I want us to move away from is the idea that it's all driven by bots and trolls. It's a societal problem at this point, where it becomes acceptable to share false news, and it doesn't damage your reputation anymore to share false news. So we need to understand it not as a technical issue, but as a societal issue that requires more than a technical fix. It will not be resolved by AI or anything. If anything, it'll actually get worse through it. So a couple of things that I try to keep in mind when I talk about in our work is, first of all, when we are developing countermeasures, we need to consider the platform interests. Platform interests are about creating engagement and attention, getting users to engage on their platforms. If we keep asking platforms to reduce engagement with those contents, it's against their interests, so they won't do it. Instead, what we need to try is work with platforms to build engagement for other types of content, to reward, maybe build incentive structures for sharing positive news instead of those polarizing ones. The other thing is work on human-centered interventions. pre-bunking or attitude inoculation, try to strengthen people instead of just waiting for platforms to implement content moderation mechanisms or develop the magical AI detection tool that will resolve this whole issue. There are a couple of other voices that you can derive from the academic literature. One is platforms have become so important that they need to be regulated like a critical infrastructure, like telephones, like the electric grid, like the power network, like anything like that. I'm not saying I'm an advocate for it, but I'm saying there are voices that are saying we need harsher regulation for it. There are middleware solution. It's a bit of a technical approach, but basically what we create is a layer in between us and the platforms by which we can decide what we get exposed to and what data the platforms themselves receive from us. And another proposal is a lot of the issues that we're facing is because those platforms that we're using are driven by American or by Chinese interests. So they have their values in mind. In particular, profit over everything, in essence. Free speech over everything. Don't regulate free speech. In Europe, we have a bit of a different understanding. We say free speech is very important, but protecting certain people and certain groups has also a great value. So in Germany, you can't deny the Holocaust. That is because we don't want people to dehumanize Jews anymore, right? So how about we create platforms that incorporate those interests instead of just engagement and attention? And lastly, fake news are here to stay. We see they are very difficult to moderate, or fake news or disinformation, and I'm putting it in quotation marks. We're seeing they're very difficult to deal with. We're seeing there are major interests in spreading false information because it is a means of information warfare and in a way to impact other societies. So they won't just go away. If you think this kind of work is important, it's important to speak up for whenever academic freedom is impacted. I've experienced it myself. I was prosecuted by some US lawyers, some US think tanks with Republican affiliation. Stanford Internet Observatory has closed its doors after years of being sued. There's an ongoing prosecution of academic freedom that's just become more and more prominent. Here in Germany, I think we're in a great spot because we still have academic freedom. We had an incident about a year ago where there was suspected that there was a target list of people who were not supposed to receive any more federal funding. There was a giant public uproar against it, and it led to consequences for people working in the Ministry of Education. It's important that we have that advocacy. If you find this kind of work important and these kinds of insights relevant, it's important to speak up for trust and safety research. Yeah, when they're prosecuted and in general for academic freedom. I'll end on that, and I look forward to your questions. I'll stop sharing the slides, and so we can engage further.
Thank you, Martin. Thank you for this very interesting lecture you made and full of news and inspiration. More than 45 people from 10 countries followed. I think we can come to an end because education is very important, as you pointed out, but also social cohesion and a lot of other things. And we try by our network to do it. And these are little steps, but I think if a lot of people make little steps, it can function to be aware and to go forward. And so thank you a lot, Martin, for this very interesting speech. And I think it will give us a lot of things to reflect. And you see, people had been grateful for your presentation and your words. And I would like to finish this evening on remembering that we, the Danube Networkers with Eloy, are starting a campaign for the moment. You see it here, and I think you got it. We are collecting postcards, digital postcards, stand up for Europe and democracy. We thank a lot for those who have sent it to us. We have now quite 200, but we hope to have 1,000 at the end of this year. And so we are here coming from 10 different countries. Please help us to have at least 1,000, but perhaps more people stand up for democracy and Europe. And this include also this very important theme for this evening. Thank you, Martin. Thank you all for coming. Thanks to the translators. Thanks to Lena, the technicians. And yes, let us come together once more in some time to give more information and to give more exchange by online. But the best would be now you go in your families and to go to friends and you say, I heard a very interesting lecture from Martin, and I have to say, and what do you think about, and what we can do, and so on. And so to, like a snowball, to give more information to others and to discuss. And as Martin said, sometimes we have to reflect, and also we have to change our point of view. So thank you very much, and see us next time. Have a good evening.
Thank you for the
Bye-bye, and
opportunity.
Martin, once more, thanks a lot.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate it. Thank you.